Previously on the keys of time.
We now have the keys that are necessary to start to systematically unveil the Bible's chronology. The first two keys revealed the divinely ordained blueprint or framework for time, which governs the progression of God's plan. Keys 1 and 2 basically say that the blueprint is a week of 7 days of 1,000 years each. The next two keys resulted in the discovery of God's redemption chronology, which exists alongside the Bible's actual chronology. Key 3 says, at the end of every jubilee cycle of 49 actual years, God adds a special 50th year of grace. This must be a measurement in the redemption chronology. Key 4 is the principle of unreckoned time, which says that God does not count times when his people's sin causes his plan of redemption to be suspended. This is convincingly revealed by the 479 completed years recorded in 1 Kings 6:1, which are 131 years short of the actual time. Now, the total times of servitude are also 131 years. So if they are subtracted from the total time, this gives exactly 479 years. The only alternative to this solution is to force the periods in Judges and Acts 13:20, which add up to 610 years, to fit into the 479 years of 1 Kings 6:1. This involves torturing the scriptures. On the other hand, when the key of redemption chronology with its unreckoned times is accepted, there is a perfect harmony of all the stated times. Again, this requires the existence of a separate redemption chronology in which the years out of fellowship are not counted. These latter keys define how time is reckoned on the redemption chronology. They are like counting the number of days of pay owed to an employee. Weekends are not reckoned because work is suspended then, that's key 4. But bank holidays, which are like jubilees, are added as extra days, even though no work was done. Hence they are days of grace. And this corresponds to key number 3. So whereas keys 1 and 2 define the structure of time that governs the redemption chronology, keys 3 and 4 tell us how redemption time, as counted by God, relates to actual time, as counted by man. This is important because the progression of time within God's overall blueprint is according to redemption time, not actual time. We now need to look at how the kings of Israel and Judah measured their reigns. An inductive study reveals the two kingdoms used different methods to measure the reigns of their kings. The first issue is when a king began counting the official years of his reign. There are two ways of doing this that we're going to look at in a minute: the accession year system or the non-accession year system. The second issue is which month was used for the start of the official year for a king's reign: Nisan, which is the first month of the calendar year, or Tishri, which is the 7th month of the calendar year. Without understanding this, we quickly run into contradictions, and it becomes impossible to harmonize the data. However, once the correct rules are discerned, everything starts to fall into place. The reigns of kings are given in whole numbers of years. Thus, it is essential to know how a king's reign was reckoned. The first issue we've looked at is when a king began counting the official years of his reign. The second issue we need to look at now is to ascertain what time of year was used for the start of regnal years. Again, there are two possibilities: Nisan in the spring or Tishri in the autumn, both of which are used as the starts of new years in different contexts. We find that certain contradictions involving synchronisms are only solved when it's understood that the two kingdoms used different starts to their regnal New Years. For example, we read in 1 Kings 15:1 that Abijah, king of Judah, began to reign in the 18th year of the reign of Jereboam, king of Israel, and he reigned 3 years. Yet, verse 9 of 1 Kings 15 says, Abijah's son Asa began to reign in Jeroboam's 20th year. Now, if the regnal years of both kingdoms began at the same time, then it would be Jeroboam's 21st year. Similarly, 1 Kings 22:51 says that Ahaziah, king of Israel, began to reign in the 17th year of the reign of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, and he reigned 2 years. Yet, 2 Kings 3:1 says, Ahaziah's successor, Jehoram, began his reign in Israel in the 18th year of the reign of Jehoshaphat, not the 19th. However, if one used Nisan years and the other used Tishri years, then the problem is easily solved. In this way, many apparent contradictions and difficulties that arise when Israel and Judah's chronologies are compared and synchronized, these contradictions are nicely resolved when it's understood which system each nation used. The usual practice in the surrounding nations of the Near East at that time was to start their regnal years in the spring. However, we noted earlier that when David began to rule from Jerusalem, he instituted Tishri-based regnal years, which coincide with the months of September-October. Solomon would have continued this practice, and we saw evidence for this in the chronology of building the temple. So it's logical that the kings of Judah from Rehoboam onward would also have continued this practice. It also makes sense that when Jeroboam of Israel rebelled, he would have marked this by changing his system to non-accession and to Nisan years, just as he set up alternative worship centers in competition to Judah. It was also in his nature to conform to the surrounding nations, especially when you consider that he had spent much time in Egypt as a political refugee, where he became acquainted with their year, which started in April at that time. This is also where he got the idea of using golden calves as a focus of worship. Thus, on starting a new kingdom, he would be inclined to conform to Egypt and Mesopotamia rather than the rival kingdom in Judah. Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 2 and 3 say, "To whom the word of the Lord came in the days of Josiah, king of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign, until the end of the 11th year of Zedekiah, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, until the carrying away of Jerusalem captive in the 5th month." The end of Zedekiah's 11th year is in the 5th month, which would only be true for Tishri years, that ended with the 6th month, which is the month Elul. This is still true today with the Jewish New Year's Day on the 1st of Tishri, which is nevertheless called the 7th month. The 1st month is always Nisan, or Abib, which is in the spring. Josiah, king of Judah, in his 18th year, held a great and memorable Passover, which we read about in 2 Kings chapter 23, verses 21 to 23.
Then the king commanded all the people, saying, "Keep the Passover to the Lord your God, as it is written in this book of the covenant." Such a Passover surely had never been held since the days of the judges who judged Israel, nor in all the days of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. But in the 18th year of King Josiah, this Passover was held before the Lord in Jerusalem.
However, 2 Kings 22, verse 3 says that all the events recorded between that verse and 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 3, all took place in the 18th year of Josiah, but before the Passover on the 14th day of the 1st month. During this time, Hilkiah, the high priest, found the book of the law, brought it to King Josiah, who repented before the Lord, and then he cleansed the whole country from pagan worship and held a Passover. Now, if this 18th year started on Nisan the 1st, all these events would have had to take place in 2 weeks, which seems impossible. Thus his 18th year must have started on the previous Tishri. The Talmud identifies this 18th year of Josiah as a jubilee year, and jubilee years always began at Tishri, so the Talmud confirms Josiah's years were Tishri-based. If Nisan-based years were used, then the jubilee would span 2 years. This helps to explain why Josiah initiated this big cleanup. As the jubilee began at the start of his 18th year at Tishri, Josiah was motivated to start repairing, cleansing and restoring the temple and its worship. The final confirmation of this approach is that it works, as discrepancies are removed, and harmony is achieved when we reckon the reigns of the kings by these rules. Solomon reigned over Israel when his father David died. He was given the commission to build the Lord's temple in Jerusalem. 1 Kings 6:1 tells us that Solomon started building the temple during the 4th year of his reign. Let's read that. It came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. 1 Kings 6:37 says, in the 4th year was the foundation of the house of the Lord laid, in the month of Ziv. Due to the 6-month change in measuring years introduced by David, to maintain accuracy, we will now have to work to the nearest half year and pay attention to the months as well as the years in which events took place. We will now study the kings of Judah and Israel, starting from Solomon's 15th year, and continuing through the time of the divided kingdom and beyond. This 490-year cycle in the chronology of redemption began in the first calendar month, which is Nisan, during Solomon's 15th year. We saw that Solomon's temple was dedicated about 6 months later in the 7th month, that's Tishri, which was actually at the opening of Solomon's 16th regnal year, since he used Tishri years. The remainder of Solomon's reign was 25 years from the temple dedication, since he reigned 40 years in total. We read in 1 Kings 11:42, the time Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. At the dedication, Solomon had completed 15 years, so he had 25 years remaining. During this time he backslid through intermarriage and idolatry. We can read about this in 1 Kings 11, verses 3 to 6.
And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. And his wives turned away his heart. For it was so, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned his heart after other gods. And his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not fully follow the Lord, as did his father David.
This sowed the seeds which led to the division of the kingdom after his death. The 10 northern tribes would revolt against the taxes imposed by Solomon's son Rehoboam. This revolt would be led by Jereboam, who Solomon had placed in charge of his northern workforce, and was prophesied to Jeroboam by Ahijah the Shilonite. We read about this in 1 Kings 11, verses 29 to 33.
Now it happened at that time, when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, that the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite met him on the way. Then Ahijah took hold of the new garment that was on him, and tore it into 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam, "Take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, Behold, I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and will give 10 tribes to you. But he shall have 1 tribe for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, because they have forsaken me, and have not walked in my ways to do what is right in my eyes, and keep my statutes and my judgments, as did his father David."
Rather than trusting in the presence and glory of God as manifested at the dedication of the temple, Solomon trusted in the arm of the flesh to build his kingdom, but it was short-lived. Although he repented in old age and wrote Ecclesiastes, the damage was done. After Solomon's death, Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his place. 1 Kings 11:43 tells us, "Then Solomon rested with his fathers, and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son reigned in his place." 1 Kings 14:21 tells us that he reigned for 17 years. And Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, reigned in Judah. Rehoboam was 41 years old when he became king. He reigned 17 years in Jerusalem. After Solomon's death, Israel had gathered at Shechem to demand relief from the heavy taxation that Solomon had imposed on them. But Solomon's son Rehoboam had decided to impose even higher taxes, despite the recommendations of his advisers. This prompted a revolt by the 10 northern tribes, leaving just the 2 southern tribes of Benjamin and Judah loyal to Rehoboam. The result was a divided kingdom. The 10 northern tribes set up the rival kingdom called Israel. 1 Kings 11:31 tells us that God gave the 10 northern tribes to Solomon's servant Jeroboam. Let's read that. "And he said to Jeroboam, Take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, Behold, I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and give 10 tribes to you." This division of the kingdom was instigated by God, and in 1 Kings 12:24 we read that the prophet Shemaiah warned Rehoboam not to pursue a civil war against the northern tribes. Jeroboam led the rebellion against Rehoboam, and we read in 1 Kings 14:20 that he reigned over Israel for 22 years. Jeroboam was an Ephraimite. As a young man, he had caught the eye of Solomon and had become a trusted servant who was placed in charge of Solomon's northern workforce. We read in 1 Kings 11:38 that God promised Jeroboam a long dynasty over the northern kingdom of Israel if he would only walk in the righteous ways of David.
Then it shall be, if you heed all that I command you, walk in my ways, and do what is right in my sight, to keep my statutes and my commandments, as my servant David did, then I will be with you and build for you an enduring house, as I built for David, and will give Israel to you.
Unfortunately for Israel, Jeroboam chose a different path. He had 2 golden calves fashioned and set up a non-Levitical priesthood in Bethel and Dan to serve in the high places and to oversee worship of the golden calves. He established Shechem on Mount Ephraim as his capital in opposition to Jerusalem. Shishak, king of Egypt, had provided refuge to Jeroboam when he had fled from Solomon during the last years of Solomon's reign. After the division of the kingdom, Shishak invaded Judah in support of Jeroboam in the 5th year of Rehoboam's reign and captured several cities, including Jerusalem. We read in 1 Kings 14:25 and 2 Chronicles 12:5-8 that the temple in Jerusalem was plundered, and Solomon's shields of gold were carried away, and Judah became a vassal of Egypt. Details of Shishak's invasion are inscribed on the walls of the Temple of Karnak at Thebes in Upper Egypt, recording Shishak's triumph over Judah and naming the cities he captured. Every successive king of Israel after Jeroboam continued to practice this form of worship that Jeroboam introduced, and so for every king the commentary is, he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Hello, I'm Derek Walker. I'm the pastor of the Oxford Bible Church. Today I want to introduce you to what I believe is a very special book called The Keys of Time, a revelation of Bible chronology. This book will give you a thorough grounding in the exciting subject of Bible chronology, revealing the keys by which you can unlock the treasure chest of God's Word concerning its revelation of time. And so we start, you see, by looking at the major keys that will unlock this treasure chest, like the fact that all time is based on the creation week, and one day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, and we look into the jubilee and how that also unlocks how God measures time, and we look at the principle of unreckoned time. And as we see the whole revelation of God in history and time fit together perfectly, we will get out of this, we'll get a revelation of the glory of God as the sovereign Lord of time, the God who is working out his purposes of grace in his perfect time, according to his redemption timetable. So through this book, God will impart to you a rich understanding of the times, giving you a fresh revelation of the special time in which we're now living near the end of the age. And it will prepare you for the momentous events that are just ahead, because we are living in the last days, and we need to understand the times that we're living in. We need to understand God's revelation of time in the Bible. And having discovered the keys and God's framework of time, we then go through each period of history, starting from Adam to Abraham, and then from Abraham to the Exodus, and then from the Exodus to the dedication of Solomon's temple, and then the period of time leading up to the decree to restore Jerusalem by Artaxerxes, and then finally Daniel's 70 weeks that take us to the coming of the Messiah himself and his death and resurrection. We look and we show how all the pieces fit together perfectly into God's framework of time, and by the end of the book you will know how to get the date of every event, every major event in the Bible, and how all these events fit together. And so this will enrich your understanding of the whole Bible and how it all fits together perfectly. And there are DVDs that go with this book that will enhance your study of it.